What could be more painful than this? I was sitting in my cramped apartment, biting into the last pack of instant noodles at the end of the month while scrolling through social media, and saw my mother showing off the new Italian tiles in her bathroom. Price $8,000. Just last week, she had coldly told me, "Maddie, I don't have even $5,000 to lend you. You'll have to figure it out yourself." That's my family when they need me. I'm their savior. When I'm broke, I'm a burden. I am Madison Clark, and I am 34 years old. I live in Seattle. My job an accountant at a small marketing firm. Every month, I barely cover the rent for my one-bedroom apartment and gas for my 10-year-old Corolla. Every morning, I wake up at 6, drink coffee, and drown myself in the dry numbers of spreadsheets. Every night, I fall asleep haunted by student loans, credit card debt, and piling bills. My family isn't any better. My father, Robert Clark, now lives with his new wife, Evelyn, the kind of woman who can turn every conversation into a lecture about living responsibly. My mother, Linda Harris, is married to Charles, a man who constantly says, "My money is for my wife," and treats me like an outsider. My brother, Daniel, is unemployed and survives by borrowing. My sister, Emily, is the family's princess married to Dr. Nathan, living in a big house, driving luxury cars, with 2 adorable kids, and her biggest concern is choosing a paint color for the new kitchen. And me. In their eyes, I'm just a walking wallet. I once drained my savings to give Daniel money to go to rehab, but he never even stepped through the center's doors. I once covered $2,000 for Emily's wedding, and she never paid me back a dime. I once sent money to repair the roof of my father's house, only to see him and Evelyn happily posting vacation photos from Cancun right after. I learned one thing: my sacrifices are nothing but a joke to them. They even laughed at the only habit I kept for myself, buying one Powerball ticket every week for $2. To them, it was a stupid game, a tax for dreamers. But for me, it was a tiny hope, a fragile slip of paper that made me feel like maybe, one day, life could change. And then, on my 34th birthday, I bought an extra ticket. Nothing special. I stopped by the usual store, and old Gus said, "Happy birthday. Maddie, who knows? Maybe today's your lucky day." I laughed it off, not believing it at all. That night, I sat alone with Thai takeout, a glass of wine Charlotte had given me, and a small cake with a single candle. When the clock struck 8:30, I lazily pulled out my phone to check the numbers, just to pass the time. The first number matched. I chuckled. The second matched too. My heart skipped a beat. Then the third. The fourth. My hands started trembling. The fifth. I held my breath. And finally, the sixth. A perfect match. I had won $50 million. After taxes, I would receive $30 million. I turned on the TV and replayed the drawing. Each number on the screen is lined up exactly. I sat frozen, my heart pounding like a drum. That $2 slip of paper in my hand had turned into a ticket of destiny. And yet, the first thought that came to my mind wasn't joy. It was my family. Daniel would beg. Emily would scold. My mother would make excuses, and my father would lecture. If they knew, I would lose everything, lose my freedom, lose myself. So I chose silence. I would live as 2 people, one Maddie crushed by bills, and one Maddie secretly holding $30 million. But how long could I possibly hide it from people who have always seen me as nothing more than a walking wallet after that fateful night? I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those familiar faces, and the painful memories came flooding back. I remembered Daniel, my brother, his eyes brimming with tears, begged just this once. Maddie, I promise I'll go to rehab. I promise I'll change. I drained nearly all my savings, $2,800 a month for 3 months straight, to support him. And then he never once set foot in the center. Just recalling that scene makes my chest ache like I've been punched hard. Then there was Emily. My beautiful younger sister was the one who always had everything. She was spoiled by our parents, and she married Nathan, a successful doctor. On her wedding day, I swiped my credit card for $2,000, thinking it was my duty to help. Emily hugged me and whispered, "Don't worry. I'll pay you back right after the honeymoon. It has been 5 years." She has never mentioned it again. And my father, Robert. He called after a storm, saying the roof of his house had blown off. I gritted my teeth and sent him money. A month later, I saw a photo of him with Evelyn, glowing on the beach in Cancun, a bright cocktail in his hand. Not a single word of thanks. My mother, Linda, was the woman who once taught me that family was the place to lean on. When Charles decided to put down a deposit for a lakefront vacation home, she happily chipped in. But when I asked to borrow $5,000, she clutched her purse and sighed. You know how strict Charles, is about money. I don't have anything extra. Each of those memories hit me like hammer blows. I let out a bitter laugh. Turns out, in their eyes, I'm nothing more than a walking bank. I wondered if tomorrow they knew I had $30 million. Would they rush to embrace me, shedding tears over family love? Or would they once again stretch out their hands, demanding, assuming I was born to sacrifice? That thought sent a chill through me. But then, in the darkness of my small apartment, an idea flickered. Cruel. Maybe. But it was the only way to know the truth. I would stage a fake story I lost my job. My company went bankrupt, and I needed to borrow $5,000 just to survive the month. I would knock on each door, and I would see who truly stood by me when there was no profit attached. The next day, I told Charlotte as we sipped wine on the balcony, "You're really going to lie to your family." Charlotte frowned, her voice tinged with disappointment. "It's not a lie. It's a test." I snapped. "This doesn't sound like you. Maddie, why not just be honest with them?" I let out a bitter laugh. "Honest. With this family, you know them. They don't listen. They only look at my wallet." Charlotte stayed quiet for a long moment, then sighed. "I know that look in your eyes. You've made up your mind. But Maddie, be careful. You might end up hurting yourself more than them." I said nothing more, but inside me, one thought rang solid and clear. If they truly love me, they won't turn their backs when I'm in need. If they do, then at least I'll finally see the true face of this family. That night, I took out a pen and paper, making a list my mother, Linda, and stepfather, Charles, my father, Robert, and stepmother, Evelyn, my sister, Emily, and her husband, Nathan, my brother, Daniel, Aunt Victoria, my cousin, Ryan, and finally, Aunt Rose. 10 people, 10 trials. I stared at the list, my heart trembling and cold all at once. This experiment would determine the future of my relationship with my own blood. One question pounded in my head: who will reach out to pull me up, and who will step on me just to keep their shiny shoes clean? I sat at the kitchen table, the list of 10 names stretched out before me like an indictment. The yellow lamp above cast shadows that made the letters tremble. I knew, once I began, there would be no way back. Inside my head, two voices clashed. One whispered, "Maddie, don't do this. They are your blood. Lying will only cause more hurt." But the other screamed blood. When they need money, they remember you. When you are desperate, they turn away. This is your only chance to see who is real and who is fake. I remembered what Charlotte said last night. She set down her glass of wine, her eyes filled with worry. "Maddie, this is going to hurt. This test might prove the very thing you fear most, that you truly are all alone." Alone. Those two words cut straight into my heart. But then I realized I had been living alone for a long time. The only difference was that I had never dared to admit it. I opened my laptop and began to type. The story needed to be convincing and detailed enough so no one would question it. I wrote the company lost a big contract and had to shut down. The CEO was under investigation for embezzlement, so I never received my final paycheck. I was drowning in hospital bills for medical tests, so the emergency fund had dried up. I needed $5,000 to pay my rent. To keep myself from falling off the edge, I read it back. Smooth, believable, and more importantly, it touched exactly on the things my family always asked about work, health, and responsibilities. I rehearsed in front of the mirror, my voice trembling, eyes glistening, my hand clenched tight as if I were holding back fear. I practiced the opening line. "You know it's not easy for me to ask, but my company just shut down, and I'm really stuck." Hearing my own voice, I felt both pity and disgust. I sneered. All those years, when they begged me, there was no script. I believed them instantly. I gave immediately. Turns out my trust was that cheap. I placed the phone beside the list, my finger tracing down each name. Who would I call first? My mother, Linda. If she truly saw me as her daughter, she wouldn't hesitate. But I knew she would glance at Charles, waiting for his nod, and that nod would surely be a no. My father, Robert. He would lecture me about saving 6 months' worth of expenses, then conclude, "You need to learn this lesson yourself." My sister Emily, I could already hear it. "You know, we just bought a car and paid the kids' tuition." My brother Daniel. No need to guess. He would hang up, vanish, like he always did. I let out a bitter laugh, drawing in a deep breath. This was not just an experiment. This was Judgment Day. That night, I lay sprawled on my bed, the gray ceiling above me swallowing me whole. I tossed and turned, my heart pounding. Familiar faces flashed across my mind, then morphed into strangers. I felt like someone caught between two worlds on one side, the poor girl begging for recognition. On the other, the woman holding 30 million in her hands, but too afraid to trust anyone. At dawn, I bolted upright. I knew that if I hesitated any longer, I would back down. I picked up my phone and dialed the first number on the list. My hand shook so badly I almost dropped it. The screen lit up Mom. I drew in a deep breath. "Now let's see. Mom, do you still see me as your daughter, or just a wallet that has finally run dry?" The phone rang 3 times. My heart felt like it was being squeezed tight. Then my mother's voice came through, familiar yet distant. "Hello, Maddie. You sound so tired. Is something wrong?" I swallowed hard, slipping into character. "Mom, my company just shut down. We lost all the contracts, and the CEO is under investigation. I haven't been paid, and the bills keep piling up. I'm really stuck." On the other end, silence for a few seconds. I could clearly hear a faint sigh. "Oh dear, that's really terrible. Sweetheart. But have you applied for unemployment yet? Or maybe try to find a more stable job?" I tried to keep my voice from trembling. "I'm looking, Mom. But right now, I need about $5,000 to cover things. I just want to keep my apartment and pay for some recent medical tests. I promise I'll pay it back as soon as I get work." A longer pause this time. I could almost hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. Then she spoke. "Hesitant Maddie, you know how it is. Charles just put down a deposit on the vacation house by the lake. Money is really tight right now. I honestly can't promise anything." I gripped the phone, my nails digging into my skin. A memory flashed so vividly years ago. Mom had called me at midnight, sobbing, begging me to send money quickly so Charles could fix the cabin for the whole family to enjoy. I scrambled, borrowed, and wired the money. And yet, that whole family only invited me once in 5 years. Do you understand? Mom, my voice broke. I really don't know where else to turn. She sighed again, this time louder. Sweetheart, maybe you could talk to your father. Evelyn will surely, have an opinion. Or Emily. Nathan makes good money. I closed my eyes, tears spilling over. The same old script. Shoving responsibility onto someone else. It was as if I were an unwanted parcel being passed around. I understand. I cut her off, my tone dropping. If you can, please let me know soon. The rent is due. Yes. I'll try to discuss it with Charles. But don't get your hopes up too high. I'm sorry. I forced a smile into the darkness, a bitter smile she would never see. I know. Good night. Mom. The call ended. The phone screen went dark, leaving me with nothing but shadows and the pounding of my heart. I exhaled sharply, like I had just swum a mile upstream. I opened the notebook I had prepared, jotting down her responses, initial concern, excuse about Charles, shifted responsibility, no commitment. Staring at those scribbled words, I felt my chest grow colder. For years, I had closed my eyes and trusted, emptied my wallet to fill the gaps for others. $2,800 a month for Daniel's rehab, which he never even started. $2,000 for Emily's wedding, and now she barely remembers her promises. Money is needed for my father to fix the roof, and only for him and Evelyn to sip cocktails by the ocean. And my mother still chose a vacation home over her own daughter. I leaned back in my chair, eyes shut. A wave of pain mixed with clarity washed over me. For the first time, I saw it plainly this family was never truly there for me. But if Mom was like this, then what about Dad, Emily, Daniel, and Victoria, Ryan? How would they react? After the call with my mother, my chest felt like someone had dumped a bucket of ice water over me. But the test wasn't over yet. If even my own mother could make excuses, I needed to know whether the rest of them would be any different. The next morning, I met my father at the familiar cafe near the school where he taught. He was already seated, looking stern, his gray tie perfectly straight as if he were about to step into a lecture. My voice trembled as I told him the made-up story the company had shut down. I hadn't received my salary. The medical bills were piling up, and I needed $5,000. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his tone flat and steady like he was delivering a lesson. Maddie, How many times have I told you, always keep 6 months of emergency funds? This is a lesson. You can't expect other people to come rescue you. I choked on my words. I'm not expecting. He cut me off before I could finish. Evelyn and I are focused on retirement. Pulling money out now would be irresponsible. You need to get back on your feet yourself. I stared at the steaming coffee cup between us, my throat tightening. Not a single dollar. Just another cold lecture. I left the cafe and drove straight to Emily's house. The mansion gleamed, the scent of expensive candles drifting through the air. Emily opened the door and hugged me tightly. Oh my God, poor you. You lost your job. That's awful for a brief second. I thought I had found some comfort. But the moment I mentioned the 5,000, her face shifted instantly. She pulled her arms back, her voice dropping. This isn't the right time, sis. We just paid for the new car, tuition for both kids, and we're remodeling the kitchen. Nathan keeps a really tight grip on our finances. I don't think I can help. I glanced at the latte steaming from her built-in espresso machine, forcing myself not to laugh bitterly. It's just a loan. Emily. My younger sister avoided my eyes. I'll ask Nathan, but don't expect too much. Clear as day? That was the limit of family ties. I texted Daniel, briefly explaining the situation. His only reply, sounds rough. I'm strapped too. Call you later. Then he vanished. My phone only gave me the long, empty beep of unanswered calls. The same man who owed me thousands of dollars couldn't even bother to call me back once. Aunt Victoria was no surprise. When I tried to bring it up, she laughed outright. I warned you. That company was doomed from the start. If you'd listened to me and gone into banking, you wouldn't be in this mess. But fine. Everyone has to pay for their choices. Don't expect anything from me. Each word stabbed like an icy knife. The last person I reached out to that day was Ryan. My cousin listened and promised with confidence, I'll write you a check tomorrow. No problem. I nearly cried from relief, but right on schedule. The next day, he sent a quick message instead. Something urgent came up. Next week. And then he disappeared. That next week never came. That night, I sat down with my little notebook and wrote out every reaction: Father, a lecture. Emily, excuses. Daniel vanished. Victoria, mockery. Ryan, empty promises. Each line cut deeper into the last illusions I had been holding on to. For years, I had used money to hold the family ties together. But tonight, I realized those ties had never truly existed at all. If they all turned their backs, who would be brave enough to reach out a hand? The list in my small notebook was almost filled with red marks, disappointments, and rejections. My father turned my plea for help into a lecture. Emily made excuses wrapped in all the luxuries of her gleaming kitchen. Daniel said he would call later and then disappeared. Aunt Victoria even used my failure as proof that she had been right. Ryan promised, as he always did, then vanished without a trace. I closed the notebook and stared at the page. Everything was chillingly clear. Not one of them was willing to reach out. Not even once. A suffocating wave of anger rose in my chest, and then I bit my lip hard to keep from crying. Family, or just a pack of calculators trading favors. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. On the screen, Aunt Rose. I hadn't even called her yet, but she was the one reaching out. Maddie, your mom just told me about your company. Are you okay? Sweetheart? Her voice was so warm and familiar that I fell silent for a few seconds. I stammered, Auntie, I'm still trying. It's really hard. Are you free tomorrow? Come have lunch with me. My treat. And Maddie. Her voice slowed, steady and certain. I want to help. The next day, I walked into a small diner near the old neighborhood where she lived. Nothing fancy, just a few worn wooden tables and the smell of sandwiches drifting from the kitchen. Aunt Rose stood up and hugged me tightly. No judgment, no lecture, just a genuine embrace. You've lost weight. Eat first, then tell me everything. She ordered something simple, chicken soup and black coffee. As I told her the job loss story, she didn't interrupt. She just listened, nodding, her eyes lightly brimming. After the table was cleared, she reached into her handbag and pulled out a worn envelope, sliding it toward me. Maddie, there are $3,000 in here. I know you need more, but this is all I have. Take it. I was stunned. Auntie, no, I can't. You still need money for your medication. I know that. She smiled, her thin hand clasping mine. Family is for leaning on when you need it. Sweetheart, I don't have much, but whatever I have is yours. Don't hesitate. I lowered my head, my eyes blurring. In that moment, I finally understood what unconditional love meant. The one who had the least gave me the most. And one more thing, she added, her voice firm yet full of love. If it ever gets too hard, my apartment always has space. The sofa pulls out into a bed. It's not spacious, but it's warm. There, you'll never be alone. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I broke down crying right there in the diner. Not the fake tears I had shed for the experiment, but real tears of someone who had just found a fragment of family she thought was lost. Driving home. I placed the envelope on the passenger seat, my trembling hand brushing against it. $3,000. Almost all of her savings. I knew that for certain. And my parents. They spent thousands on vacations and Italian-tiled bathrooms. Emily bought a new Audi. Ryan burned money at the casino. Yet not one of them offered a hand. The mirror was far too clear now. Greed, selfishness, and one small but blazing light from the only person who truly cared. I gripped the steering wheel, one thought bursting in my mind. If anyone deserved to know the truth, it was Aunt Rose. That evening, I invited Aunt Rose to my small apartment. She sat in the worn fabric chair, holding a cup of hot tea, looking exhausted after a long day of teaching. I looked into her eyes, the deep lines carved by years of worry, and my throat tightened. "Aunt," I began, my heart pounding. "I need to tell you the truth. I didn't lose my job. My company is still running as usual." Aunt Rose froze for a moment, setting the teacup down. Her eyes held no reproach, only patient waiting. I made it all up. I wanted to see who in the family would help if I were in need. And you were the only one who reached out, even though you barely had enough yourself. She stayed silent for a few seconds, then gave a small nod. "I'm not angry, but Maddie, why would you torture yourself like that?" I took a deep breath and finally released the secret that had weighed on me for 3 weeks. I won the lottery. Aunt, Powerball, $50 million. After taxes, it's $30 million. Her eyes widened, but she didn't scream, didn't gush with excitement. She just looked at me for a long while. "Oh, Lord. Maddie." Her voice trembled softly. I clutched her thin, frail hand. "You're the first person I've told. Not Dad, not Mom, not Emily, not Daniel. Only you. Because you were the one who gave from your heart, even when you thought I had nothing to give back." A watery smile spread across her lips. Money is not as important as that truth. I'm happy that you finally see it clearly. I nodded, tears spilling down my face. At that moment, I knew I had made the right choice. 2 days later, I sat in the gleaming glass office of attorney Philip Monroe. He opened the thick file in front of him and spoke in a calm tone. We will set up a trust fund under Aunt Rose's name. It will cover all hospital bills and medication and provide a monthly income for the rest of her life. She won't have to worry about anything. I nodded firmly. And I want to buy her a small house just a few blocks from me. A warm place, close to the hospital, peaceful enough for her to live comfortably. Philip smiled and jotted down notes. You've thought this through very wisely. Many lottery winners let money destroy them, but you're turning it into the foundation for a new life. I listened, my heart swelling with strange emotions, gratitude and resentment. Gratitude because I had found truth in the gentle light of Aunt Rose. Resentment because the others, my father, my mother, my brother, my sister, had all had their chances but chose to turn away. That night, when I came home, I looked at the envelope of $3,000 that Aunt Rose had given me. I would never forget that moment. The one who had the least gave the most. And now, with $30 million in my hands, I swore I would never let her live another day in hardship. I knew the storms with my family weren't over yet, but at least now, I had a true ally. Rumors spread faster than I thought. Just a few days later, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. First, it was my mother, Maddie. I heard you got a new job with a high salary, and yet you went around calling people for money. Do you know how embarrassing that makes me feel? Her voice was a mix of scolding and self-defense, stripped of any warmth. I sat in silence, gripping the phone tightly. Embarrassing for her. What about me? I had knelt down, begging her for help, only to be met with rejection. Then came my father. He didn't bother with small talk. Stephanie told me you've been calling people everywhere asking for money. Maddie, this is irresponsible behavior, which is exactly what I predicted. I'm disappointed. I let out a dry laugh that burned my throat. Disappointed. Were you disappointed when Evelyn and you used the money I sent to go on vacation? I wanted to scream, but all I managed was to swallow the bitterness. A text from Emily came next. Sis, I heard people talking. Why did you have to ask so many people? You made Nathan and me really uncomfortable. Next time, don't put me in that situation again. I stared at the screen, remembering the look in my sister's eyes when she pulled her hand away from mine in that gleaming kitchen just days ago. Uncomfortable. Were those years I broke my back paying off your wedding credit card debt so comfortable? Then Daniel sent a curt message. Unbelievable. That was low. Maddie. I stared at the words, choked. The man who once borrowed thousands of dollars from me and never paid me back now had the nerve to call me low. Everything came crashing down at once. A storm of accusations, blame, and finger-pointing. No one cared to remember the moment I had trembled, begging them for help. That night, I sat in my small apartment, the yellow lamplight casting shadows on the wall, staring at the old list. Beside each name, I added new words: accusations, blame, and avoidance. The entire notebook now looked like the truest picture of my family, a shattered mirror, and in the middle of that chaos, I remembered Aunt Rose's eyes. The only one who didn't ask, "How will you pay it back?" but simply said, I'm here. I realized that what I had lost was never truly mine, and what I had found was a love without conditions that was worth more than $30 million in the bank. But my family wasn't done yet. I knew, sooner or later, they would try to drag me back into the same vicious cycle: guilt, responsibility, and empty wallets. This time, I would not let them win. If you're still listening now, maybe your heart aches along with mine. Have you ever experienced being turned away by your own family? Leave a comment and share your story. And if this story touched you, please subscribe to Bitter Scars and share this video with those who need to hear it, that sometimes family is not the safe place we expect, and true love can come from the most unexpected places. I knew I couldn't just let them keep putting the blame on me. After everything that had happened, I needed to speak up once and for all. So I sent a group text this Sunday, 7 p.m. Everyone come to my apartment. There's something important. The small apartment quickly filled up. Mom sat next to Charles, her face heavy with tension. Dad sat with his arms crossed, and Evelyn glared at me as if she were about to pass judgment. Emily and Nathan arrived late, their expensive perfume overpowering the room. Daniel stayed in the back, eyes glued to his phone. Aunt Victoria crossed her legs, her lips curved into a mocking smile. Ryan didn't look up from his device, but it was obvious he was listening. I stood in the center of the room, my heart pounding. This was it. No more pretending. Thank you all for coming. I know there have been a lot of rumors lately. Tonight, I want to set the record straight. Emily frowned. Are you going to explain why you've been begging people for money? I looked her straight in the eye. Yes. I called each one of you. I said I lost my job and needed $5,000 to get by. But the truth, most of you dodged, made excuses, or even turned it into a joke. My father slammed the table. Maddie, you dared to lie just to test the family that is completely irresponsible. I laughed, a bitter laugh. Irresponsible. And what about the times I emptied my savings for Daniel, for Emily, for you, for Mom, only to be left behind when I was struggling? The only one who reached out was Aunt Rose, the one person who shouldn't even have been able to help. The room went silent. Aunt Rose sat quietly in the corner, her eyes gentle but filled with sorrow. I continued, my voice stronger now. I don't need your money. I needed the truth. And now it's clear to you. I've only ever been a walking wallet. Every time there's trouble, I get summoned. But when I need help, I'm nothing more than a burden. Nathan cleared his throat, trying to ease the tension. Maybe everyone's just been too busy. Maddie, don't take it so hard. I turned to him, my gaze sharp. Too busy buying a new Audi? Too busy laying Italian tiles in the bathroom? Too busy putting down deposits on vacation homes at the lake? Meanwhile, I was busy swallowing my tears, making desperate calls for help. Is that what you call being busy? Emily's face flushed as she avoided my eyes. Dad mumbled under his breath, but had no argument left. I took a deep breath, gathering all my courage. Consider this my resignation. I officially resign from the role of family bank. From now on, don't come to me when you're drowning in debt or looking for extra money to show off. I'm not there anymore. The air grew heavy. No one met my eyes, except for Aunt Rose, who gave me a small nod, a silent sign of agreement. Inside my chest, I felt a mix of pain and relief. I had torn off the mask I'd worn for so long, and now they would have to face their true selves. After I dropped the words resign from the role of the family bank, The room sank into a heavy silence. Only the dry ticking of the wall clock filled the air. My mother turned her face away. Her voice choked. "You shouldn't say that. Maddie, we're still family." I looked straight at her. Family doesn't abandon one another when someone begs for help. Mom, family doesn't value money over love. Charles placed his hand on her shoulder, tugging lightly as if to end the argument. I caught his gaze, cold and calculating. His slight nod told me everything in their minds. I had been erased long ago. My father stood, reaching for his coat. "My daughter used to understand responsibility. Now you've turned everything into a game. I have nothing more to say." Evelyn quickly followed, not forgetting to throw me a daggered glance. Selfish. Emily sat still, her lips trembling. Nathan gently touched his wife's hand, urging her to leave. Before standing up, Emily whispered with her eyes fixed on the floor, "You've changed. I don't recognize you anymore." I almost laughed. "Changed? No. I had simply stopped pretending," Daniel muttered. "This makes me really uncomfortable. Really." Then he walked out without looking at me once. Aunt Victoria shook her head, lips pressed tight. "You'll regret this. Maddie, family isn't something you throw away when it suits you." Ryan trailed behind her, his phone screen glowing as if the whole evening were nothing but another distraction. The door slammed shut, leaving the small apartment in silence. Only Aunt Rose and I remained. She placed her hand on my shoulder, squeezing gently. "You did what needed to be done. Painful. Yes, but necessary." I collapsed into the chair, burying my head in my hands. Instead of emptiness, I felt a curtain of illusion being torn away. No more assumptions about family bonds. No more hazy hope that one day they would acknowledge the sacrifices I had made. I had seen the truth those ties had rotted long ago. Tonight's gathering was just the final drop that shattered the crack I had been patching for years. Outside, Seattle's night draped its shadows over the rain-slicked streets. I stared through the window, exhaling slowly and deeply. My family, at least on paper, still existed. But in reality, we had already fallen apart. And in that wreckage, I saw something else, freedom. I thought that after the meeting, things would calm down. But only 2 days later, the doorbell rang furiously. When I opened it, I saw my mother, Emily, and Daniel standing right there, their faces a mixture of anger and unease. "Maddie, we need to talk," my mother said, her voice so stern that even the neighbors turned their heads. I let them in. The air in the room was thick, like a storm about to break. Emily was the first to speak. "You've embarrassed the whole family. Who makes up stories like that if outsiders hear it? They'll think we're an irresponsible family." I laughed, a dry, hollow laugh. With no strength left to pretend, "Emily, you're worried about what outsiders think, while I'm drowning and the family is watching me sink. I asked for 5,000, not 50,000, and all I got in return was avoidance." Daniel cut in, his voice sharp. "You don't understand my situation. I'm struggling too. How can I give you anything when I barely have anything myself?" I looked him straight in the eyes. "How many times have you owed me?" "Daniel, how many promises have you made and then disappeared? Have you ever paid me back a single dollar?" Daniel lowered his head in silence. My mother placed her hand on the table, trying to calm the tension, but her voice trembled. "Maddie, you're being too harsh. Parents can't always help their children. I have Charles. I have other burdens." I clenched my fists, each word sharp like a blade. No, Mom. The truth is, you had a choice. And you chose the vacation home. You chose Charles, instead of choosing your own daughter. The room tilted into silence. My breath came hard, my heart pounding. Then I let out everything I had been holding back. I'm tired of pretending we're a loving family, the reality. When you need me, I'm your support. But when I need you, I'm a burden. You want me to stay quiet, bow my head, and keep opening my wallet. But I'm done. I won't play the role of a walking ATM for one more second. Emily burst into tears, while my mother covered her face with her hand. Daniel looked like he wanted to say something, but swallowed it back. I could see it clearly in their eyes. It wasn't regret. It was fear of losing their source. I stood up, pointing toward the door. If you came here to silence me, to make me feel guilty, then please leave. From now on, I choose truth over illusion. No one moved. Only the ticking of the wall clock hammered each pause. Finally, my mother sighed quietly and stood up. Emily helped her to the door, with Daniel trailing behind. The door closed. I leaned my forehead against the wall, tears streaming down not from weakness, but because, for the first time in my life, I had dared to say everything I had kept buried inside. After the door closed, the apartment sank into silence. I stood still, my back against the wall, listening to the sound of my heartbeat slowly calm down. In that silence, I suddenly realized I had never felt so relieved before. I turned on the light and cleaned up the glasses, which were still streaked with water. My hands trembled slightly, but it was no longer the trembling of fear. It was the release of tension. For so many years, I had lived in an invisible cage called family duty. Every decision, every dollar, was weighed against their expectations. And tonight, for the very first time, I shattered that cage. I sat down on the sofa, exhaled, then let out a soft laugh. A smile escaped from the deepest part of my chest. Maddie, you finally did it. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The Seattle rain drizzled outside my window. I brewed a cup of coffee and sat there, watching the raindrops gather along the windowsill. No longer did I feel the heaviness of thinking about my family. No longer did I ask myself, am I good enough for them to love me? All I felt was peace. Charlotte called, hearing my voice. She was surprised. Maddie, you sound completely different. Lighter. I laughed. I told them everything. Char. Every single thing. There's nothing left to hide, and you know what? For the first time in years, I feel like silence itself is peaceful. That's the Maddie I remember, Charlotte replied, her voice full of pride. After the call, I opened the notebook I had once used to record everyone's reactions. The messy lines read excuses, disappearance, empty promises, mockery. I picked up my pen and drew one final line at the bottom. The truth has been revealed, and I don't need their validation anymore. That afternoon, I went to visit Aunt Rose. She was sitting by the window of her old apartment, reading a book. When she saw me, she smiled, a smile that reminded me what unconditional warmth felt like. I told her everything: the meeting, the confrontation, the cruel words. She held my hand and said slowly, Maddie, you were brave. You don't need their recognition to be valuable. You just need to believe that you are worthy. I hugged her tightly, tears streaming down my face. But this time, They no longer tasted bitter. They were tears of peace. That night, I sat down to write in my journal, I no longer search for love in those who chose to turn their backs. I choose myself, and I choose the ones who truly stay. Closing the page. I looked up at the city lights outside. For the first time in years, the noise of Seattle didn't make me feel lost. I knew my worth had never been in a wallet or in half-hearted approval. It was within me, the woman who was brave enough to finally say, enough. There was a strange silence after the confrontation with my family. I thought I would collapse, but instead, I felt lighter than ever. No longer haunted by the need to prove myself worthy in their eyes, I could finally breathe fully. And as that space opened up, a new question emerged. What would I do with this freedom? I remembered the conversation with Philip, the lawyer who had recently helped me with legal paperwork. He looked straight at me, his voice low but full of weight. Maddie, you've endured the cruelest betrayal from your own family. But this pain, if you know how to use it, can turn into something greater. You could help those who were abandoned, just like you were abandoned. I carried those words with me, turning them over night after night. Then an idea sparked. At first, just a tiny flicker, creating a fund. Not some grand, untouchable foundation, but simply a place where I could gather resources and help those who were vulnerable, especially elderly people left behind by their families. People like Aunt Rose are overlooked and abandoned, yet they are still living with kindness in their hearts. I named the fund Second Chance. It sounded simple, but it was everything I had ever longed for, a second chance. The early days were clumsy. My office was just a rented room on the third floor of an old building. With a battered wooden desk I had bought off Craigslist. Charlotte, the only friend who had never abandoned me, sat across from me, so eager that it made me laugh. I'll handle the medical and healthcare side. You take care of finance and planning. The two of us. It sounds like a startup, doesn't it? The work began with small things: repairing the leaky roof of an 80-year-old woman's house, buying insulin for a retired man, organizing a surprise birthday for a grandmother who lived alone with no visitors. They weren't big projects, but every smile, every teary-eyed look made me feel like my heart was being stitched back together. Then one day, something unexpected happened. A local reporter heard about us and came to interview us. The article was published with the headline, "The Woman Who Turned Betrayal into Compassion." I read every line with my throat tightening. From a bitter story, somehow, something good had bloomed. The ripple effect spread faster than I imagined. One evening, after our very first fundraising event, I was sitting alone in the darkened hall when my phone buzzed. A message from an unfamiliar woman read, "Your story gave me the courage to finally sign the divorce papers after years of being belittled by my husband. I realized I deserve respect. Thank you." I sat in silence, holding the phone in my hand, my eyes blurring with tears. I had never thought the cracks in my own life could light the way for someone else. But now, I understood the true impact wasn't measured by the money we raised, but by the truth revealed that we don't have to keep enduring just to be called family. My family may never change. They may always see me as the betrayer. But out there, strangers had found hope in my journey. And maybe that was the real victory. When my name appeared in the local newspaper, I knew there would be a reaction from the family, but I never expected it to come so quickly and so fiercely. Just a few weeks later, I got a call from an old friend who worked in real estate. "Maddie, have you heard the news Charles and your mother are caught up in a lawsuit? Their resort project is under investigation for financial fraud." I stayed silent. There was no sense of satisfaction like I had once imagined, only an emptiness I couldn't name. On the day of the trial, I was there, not for revenge, but to see it with my own eyes. In the courtroom, the bright lights shone down on Charles's tense face. He wore a suit, but sweat was trickling from his temples. My mother sat beside him, her coat neatly buttoned, yet her eyes betrayed panic. The judge read the indictment: contract fraud, misuse of investment funds, and the risk of embezzling millions of dollars from clients. Each word hit my ears like a hammer striking metal. Evelyn, Charles's wife, sat behind them. Her face was stiff, her eyes red and swollen. Emily and Daniel did not show up. Perhaps they were too ashamed or too afraid of being dragged into it. During the arguments, the opposing attorney emphasized, "The evidence shows they used part of the bank loan for personal spending, including travel, luxury shopping, and renovations on private real estate." The room stirred with whispers. I clenched my hands tight. This was the money once promised for the future. The money withheld when I begged for help. When it was Charles's turn to speak, he tried to steady his voice. "I only wanted to provide for my family. We never meant to commit fraud," but the trembling in his words gave everything away. My mother was then called to the stand. She spoke softly, her voice nearly breaking. I trust my husband. I didn't know about this." The judge held his gaze on her for a long moment, his expression heavy. At last, the verdict was delivered. Charles was sentenced to 3 years of probation and a massive financial penalty. Part of his and my mother's joint assets were confiscated. Their family collapsed right there in that courtroom, stripped of the glamour they once flaunted. I walked out of the courthouse and drew in a deep breath. There was no triumphant cheer, only the cold wind rushing through the courthouse corridor, carrying with it a vague sensation, something between relief and regret. On the way home, I received a text from Emily. "Are you happy now? Everything is destroyed. You've won." I stared at the words, my chest heavy. Won. If this was victory, why did it taste so bitter that night? I sat alone by the window, watching the city lights. I thought of my mother, of the look in her eyes inside that courtroom. Part of me wanted to hold her, to tell her everything would be all right. But another part screamed she chose to abandon me, and now she was abandoned by the very man she trusted. This victory wasn't simple. It wasn't me standing tall over ruins, laughing with pride. It was a complicated picture where justice had been served, but family bonds were lost forever, and I realized that was the true cost of betrayal. The trial closed like a funeral bell tolling for my family. Charles walked out with a suspended sentence, and my mother bowed her head, looking as if she had aged 10 years. I stood in the hallway, watching them pass by without stopping. No more tears, no more anger, just a decisive silence. That night, I sorted through old papers in my apartment. For years, they had piled up medical bills I had once handled on my own, letters of plea I had sent and been ignored, even a faded family photograph. I gathered everything, placed it in a cardboard box, and carried it down to the recycling area on the ground floor. When I let the box drop, I heard the echo of its fall like a farewell. The next morning, I went to visit Aunt Rose. As always, she brewed tea and set it on the table. I told her about the trial, about my mother's eyes, about Emily's spiteful messages. She held my hand and said gently, "Maddie, sometimes a door has to slam shut before you can see another one opening." I nodded. Deep down, I knew she was right. The Second Chance Fund kept growing stronger. Charlotte and I launched more projects: a mobile healthcare program, a small community center where the elderly could gather and share. For the first time, I saw my future clearly, a future no longer bound by twisted expectations or contempt. One afternoon, I stood in front of the new building we had rented for the foundation. The sign glowed in the evening sun, the words "Second Chance Foundation" gleaming. I took a deep breath, feeling the Seattle wind sweep through my hair. In that moment, I knew this was the beginning of an entirely new chapter. The old family was still out there somewhere, fumbling in their own chaos. But I was no longer the girl begging to be acknowledged. I had cut the rope that bound me, no longer letting them define my worth. That evening, while writing in my journal, I wrote, "Some bridges must be burned to save yourself. I have no regrets, because through that fire, I found freedom." I closed the notebook and looked up at the city lights flickering on. For the first time, those lights didn't make me feel lost. They felt like a welcome signal, a reminder that from here, I was free to write my own story. Not one that begins with betrayal, but one that begins with freedom. Perhaps the most painful part was not losing money or enduring betrayal, but realizing that sometimes family is the one pushing you off the cliff. Yet from that darkness, I found the strength to stand, to turn pain into the lamp that lights the path for myself and for others. If you have ever been abandoned, ever been belittled, remember this: you don't need validation from the one who hurt you to exist. You have the right to walk away, the right to rebuild your life in your own way. This is not just my story. It might also be yours, and the story of thousands out there. So share, comment, and don't forget to subscribe to Bitter Scars, because here, scars are not meant to be hidden. They are meant to be told, turned into strength,